Dr. Lobb, has there been any anecdotal human testing with humic acid as an antiviral?
Oh yes, there is quite a substantial volume now of human testing with humic acid against a range of illnesses. Certainly herpes, particularly simplex 1 and 2. Taking humic acid, for example, will decrease, if not totally stop, herpes simplex 2 outbreaks. For example, genital herpes outbreaks. Cold sores stop appearing. Some people have simplex 1 type cold sores inside their mouth where you don't have just 1 or 2 cold sores, which probably most all of us get at one time or another, but a whole mouthful of sores. That's quite a different situation. It's quite a painful situation. And humic acid will stop the recurrence of those kinds of outbreaks as well. In the case of influenza, dozens and dozens of people that I'm aware of have taken humic acid for the flu. And essentially the flu, when taking humic acid in appropriate amounts, amounts to about a one and a half day event. So you're sick for 1 day, the next day you're pretty much over it, the day after that you're back to normal. So instead of spending a week to 10 days in bed, really very sick, you're back to normal within 2 to 3 days without any problem at all. And of course that's very important with regard to the bird flu, which is just another influenza. The common influenzas in the world today are what are referred to as H3N2 and H1N1. For several years now we've had those two strains that have been the cause of the world's flu outbreaks. It's somewhat unusual to have a mixture of two, but nevertheless that's the case. And they've been around for quite some time. H5N1 is also the flu virus, a flu virus. It's called the bird flu because it originates with birds, but in fact all influenzas, so far as we know, originate with ducks and chickens, particularly in Asia, and very particularly when the fowl are raised with swine. The viruses originate with the birds, they're incubated in the swine, people eat the swine, come in contact with the swine, and contract the flu. The flu then eventually mutates such that it becomes contagious person to person, and that's how we have outbreaks of the flu. Bird flu is, again, referring to H5N1, this so-called killer strain of flu that lots of people are very, very worried about, is just another influenza strain. So the fact that the humic acid is very highly efficacious against existing strains of flu, H3N2, H1N1, as well as influenza B, several strains. The National Institutes of Health have verified in testing my materials. That's a very good sign that humic acid will also be very effective against the H5N1 flu, the so-called bird flu or avian flu. Humic acids have also been tested, at least my materials have been tested as well against AIDS, hemorrhagic fever viruses, hepatitis C, for which we have a fairly substantial amount now of anecdotal evidence. In the case of hepatitis C, combination of interferon and humic acid will reduce the viral load to non-detectable levels in about a month or less. In the case of AIDS, the use of an AIDS cocktail in conjunction with humic acid appears to be most efficacious. Those studies are still ongoing. AIDS is a very difficult virus to deal with, primarily because it appears now to be systemic. It's not confined just to the blood system or the lymphatic system or bone marrow. The AIDS virus hides in pools in a number of regions throughout the body, and to eliminate it entirely from the body is very, very difficult. There are the problems as well of latently infected cells as well as chronically infected cells. latently infected cells produce AIDS virus when stimulated to do so, but can otherwise lie dormant for years. Chronically infected cells produce AIDS virus all the time. They don't require the infusion of viral RNA from a viral particle attaching to the host cell surface. The cell's mechanism of producing DNA, which is turned into RNA, viral RNA, and then produces more AIDS virus, just continues to produce that material all the time without having to be stimulated to do so. So chronically as well as latently infected cells in the case of AIDS are another two other very severe problems with that disease. However, we have some anecdotal evidence that, in fact, when taken with AIDS drug cocktails, including protease inhibitor materials, humic acid turns out to be very beneficial in fighting that disease. In the case of psoriasis, which is just begun to be studied by myself and other folks that I'm also doing R&D work with, psoriasis appears, interestingly enough, to be treatable with humic acid. Taking humic acid internally, again 250 milligrams or thereabouts 3 times a day, as well as applying humic acid in an appropriate transdermal delivery system. When applied externally to areas affected by psoriasis, appears in fact to reduce the appearance of psoriasis, the scaly, flaky skin, scabs, bleeding, that sort of situation that psoriasis sufferers have had for years. In a couple test cases we've looked at, over 20 years psoriasis sufferers have had these conditions, these skin conditions, which in fact clear up within a matter of a month to 2 months on the use of humic acid, both internally as well as applied topically, again with an appropriate transdermal delivery system. So efficacy against psoriasis is certainly very interesting, because the mechanism whereby humic acid works in that particular case is so far has not been established, and that's part of what makes it interesting. But how it can in fact be effective against psoriasis, the skin disorder essentially, eczema as well, is very interesting. And there are several recent literature reports which prompted my studies of this situation that confirm that in fact humic acid is effective against such skin disorders. Other interesting viruses against which humic acid shows efficacy include hemorrhagic fever viruses. These would include Ebola, the Ebola family of viruses. Marburg is one version of such viruses. Dengue fever is another one that is common in Chiapas in Mexico and is spread to the United States. Another interesting virus that humic acid should be effective against, although we have no evidence yet, but it should be effective against West Nile in people. I have substantial anecdotal evidence that West Nile is preventable in horses, for example, by taking in humic acid. That is particularly important in Central California, for example, where West Nile, equine West Nile, that is West Nile that appears in horses, that is a problem in that area. And by using humic acid as a feed supplement, we're able to combat contracting of West Nile virus. So those are some of the viruses for which we have pretty solid anecdotal evidence, as well as pretty strong and well-documented in vitro evidence for which humic acid has been used and has in fact proven effective.